Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Duncan from St. Martin in the Fields charity. Just going to give it a minute to see if anyone else is going to clock on through. Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is not too cold wherever you are. So thank you for finding the time to join us for today's session on homelessness and bereavement. A chance to hopefully step back from the day to day to reflect on something that's really important in our sector and as professionals and personally. Uh, we're delighted. I'm the Chief Executive of St. Martin in the Fields charity. We support individuals directly into accommodation, frontline workers, and want to help the sector invest in new solutions. And obviously, homelessness, death, loss, love, and bereavement are really key issues for us and for you on the call. We've got four excellent speakers joining us today. Gill Taylor from the Museum of Homelessness, Mark Brennan from Housing Justice, Pam Orchard from The Connection, and Amy Hutton from Cyrenians Scotland. From the attendees list, I saw we've got a great spread of people from across the homelessness sector in terms of geographies and roles. And hopefully this is a space for people to kind of listen, reflect, and share. Do put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. If you've got a question for later, do put it in the Q&A because it can get lost in the chat and you can kind of comment in the chat. We're going to have some opening reflections from me, and then we're going to hear from each of the speakers for up to 5 to 10 minutes reflecting on issues around bereavement and loss. And then we really want a conversation where we'll pull out some threads between people, but also respond to your questions too. So hopefully that works, everybody. We are recording this session in order that others who aren't able to log on now can see it at a later date. Obviously, just for you to be aware of that in terms of kind of what you might say and if there's anything you makes you think of whether you do or don't want to share. Um, just to kick us off, three small reflections from myself, if I may. And the first is I've been in and around the homelessness sector for 20 years. Many of you will have been around for longer, some maybe for less. Not in frontline roles, but around policy and research. But I'm very struck by when I was at Crisis, first couple of bits of research that we did then at that stage was first of all update the age of death research, which many of people still talk about today in terms of that sad, very sad reflection that the age of death of a homeless person is on average 43, and that figure fluctuates maybe a bit year on year, but has never really, it's stubbornly stayed in the 40s in the sixth largest economy in the world. Second was on roots into homelessness and how death and grief was very much part of that. So for men, often the death of a family member was an antecedent on their homelessness journey, and particularly for women, maybe the death of a child was there. And so sadly, homeless people are dying too young, and death and grief is very much a part of their journey to and through homelessness. The second reflection I wanted to say was last week in St. Martin the Fields Church, just next door, um, homelessness sector came together to remember those who had experienced homelessness but died in the last year. Huge thanks to Mark and many others from the Museum of Homelessness and Housing Justice, as and many other partners to bringing that together. We remembered over 1,600 names, and it was important to do so. But it was also striking how many people from the sector were there, from the frontline workers and beyond, and that this was a space for them to kind of pause and reflect on those they've worked with and um, uh, and what it means, and that whether you're of a faith or not, that's the importance of kind of paused space to reflect. The ritual of grieving and remembering is really important for those who've been homeless and those who support those who've been homeless. And as part of the service, we also pay tribute to an individual, Vicky Fox, who was our trustee, but Amy's colleague. And it was also an important moment to kind of remember that personally, but it brought home that sometimes people leave too soon and too suddenly, and we need to kind of take that space to reflect that. And then the third reflection to kick us off, if I may, is a personal reflection. Um, uh, So all of us today will bring a mixture of the personal, the professional, the practical, and the emotional to this topic. I lost my mother when I was 19. She died of a brain tumor, and this probably remains one of the most significant events of my life. We were lucky to be able to care for her at home, which obviously for many homeless people isn't a reality. But the reason I mention it is I was, well, I went off the rails a bit afterwards. I was at university. I was supported by friends, and but I, drank too much and engaged in various other practices. But 20 years after her death, I wrote a Twitter thread, those in the days when people did use Twitter, about loss and grief. And I got a huge response. And in it, I talked about the importance of talking about death. And I had people contact me from literally all over the world who said they'd lost a family member or a friend, and they too were suffering in an environment where people weren't talking and people weren't listening. And that one message, I think, if we take away anything from today, is that we all need to talk a lot more about death, what it means, and how we respond to it. Because if there's one certainty in life, it is that sadly at some point it will end. For homeless people, it's ending too soon. And if we don't better deal with it, we leave scars for those who work with or those who know those who sadly passed away. So we all need to talk more about death, loss, grief, and bereavement. And today, hopefully, will help us to do so. So thank you for listening. I hope you get something out of this session. Thank you very much to those people who are going to share as our speakers, but you share and just reflecting in your own quiet way or in the questions that you ask. And if I may, I'm going to ask Pam to reflect from her perspectives at the collection and elsewhere to share her thoughts. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Duncan. I hope people can hear me. If you can't, it'll get better. It's something about the microphone on my laptop. So I'm just going to start by just saying a little bit about the service of commemoration, which is for those of us who work at St Martin's and Mark and Gill who were there and very involved in it. It's a real sort of annual marking of respect for people who've died, and it's normally around homeless people, but often we'll remember people who've worked in the sector, and we put forward names of people who've died during the year, and the connection staff team identified 13 people. So I thought I'd just say a few things about, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the individuals, but just a few sort of themes from there. 6 of those people used drugs, and we think that they were that their drug use was associated with their early death, and several of them also drank quite a lot. One of them was found in a tent about 100 meters away from our building in a place called Bridges Place. One of them was found in her room in our supported accommodation, having died overnight. 2 people died from cancer conditions which went untreated for a long time. And one of those people was in palliative care, fortunately, when that happened. We had someone who died in prison that we knew really well. And there's one person who we think killed themselves, but it's actually quite difficult to know for sure. And I'm just highlighting those things just to give a bit of a sense of what's going on for people and bringing a bit more of the sort of tangible and specifics to those deaths. So this is something that happens quite regularly at the connection, and we're quite familiar with it. So we've got a policy, so much fun, really cheery, about how to respond when people die. And the purpose of that policy is to make sure that we are dealing with that death appropriately, and the organisation has a duty of care to clients, but also to our staff and volunteers. So we need to make sure that we're sort of responding properly. We want to make sure that clients are treated respectfully and with cultural sensitivity. And we want staff to feel confident about what to do, having discovered somebody who's died, because it is incredibly shocking and difficult. And the last thing that we want people to do is sort of feel like they don't know what to do, and they're sort of flailing around in their, with their own personal response, and also just really worrying about whether or not they're doing the right thing. So we want to make sure that people are properly supported. So it's got sections on dealing with unexpected deaths and what you do when you find someone, and things like, there might be members of the public around, particularly because we're working with rough sleepers in central London. There's a whole load of stuff about how you report on it, both internally and externally. So that's sort of internally, senior managers and trustees and that kind of stuff, but externally, engagement with the police. We may also need to go to the charity commission to report a serious incident, and we keep the death confidential as much as we can until the next of kin is informed, but that can be quite tricky. Then there's a section on staff support. So in the immediate aftermath, we offer talking support and time away and initial debrief. But there's also quite a lot of longer term consequences. So we've got various things in place to enable deeper reflection and support if it's needed, including access to our psychologists. We've got an employee assistance program where people can speak to a counsellor. There's kind of more generic HR support. And it may be that someone needs support very initially and then things move on and they feel okay. It may be that it doesn't manifest, the grief doesn't manifest itself until a bit later, and everybody is different. So we need the flex to be able to accommodate people's different reactions. And there's some very practical stuff about client belongings, because it's not always obvious what to do with them. And people have quite often either not got an easily contactable next of kin, or they do have a next of kin, but they're not immediately available. And we need to know what to do about handing stuff back to people. And there's also things like people's meds, which is quite often an issue, particularly things like methadone, as well as other prescriptions. And then we have a section about risk management in accommodation, because we, and sort of being proactive about doing things like room checks and welfare checks and things like that. So that I've said to Naomi that policy is available. If you ask her, you can have it. And it may or may not be relevant for your setting, but it's quite practical. We've also got some less formal things in place to make sure that we're celebrating and marking people's lives with sensitivity and respect. And one of the major bonuses of being attached to a large liberal Anglican church is that there is a vicar whose responsibility is to respond to this kind of situation. And he leads the annual service of commemoration and does an amazing, incredibly appropriate job of it. But he also will step in and do things for individual clients when they've died. And that means that we'll quite often do something for clients and staff members, which is very culturally and religiously appropriate, depending on what that client was like and what their likely wishes might have been. And often people from other agencies come to that. And where we can, we'll include family members. So we did this for a client who was estranged from his family, and reached out to his mother to let him know to let her know that he died. And he was quite a tricky guy, and she was so relieved that we'd got in touch with her, because she said there is nobody else who will have anything positive to say about him apart from me. And to know that there was another agency or some people out there who actually knew him quite well and were able to see him in a more positive and kind of strength-based way was such a comfort to her. And we were able to use some of her words and anecdotes in the celebration that we did about him. We've also done things like get involved in people's palliative care and get people off the streets and into a hospice. And then it's been a real privilege to be involved in the sort of end of life care, coordinating some of the medical care and the social services. But also, it's like if someone's on the streets and they've got a terminal long-term health condition, to be able to massively increase their quality of life in the last few weeks and months of their time on earth is amazing. But we've also been able to do things like work through with them what they want their funeral arrangements to be and that kind of thing. I was asked to say a bit about challenges. I suppose the first thing I want to say is, it says when you're doing this work, I mean, our theory of change is all about building relationships of trust with people. So our staff get to know people and are trained and supported to be as positive as they can be about people, and exercise a lot of compassion. And if you're doing that kind of work with your staff team, it will come as no surprise that people find it very upsetting when someone that they built a relationship with has died. And they may also feel very responsible and feel like, you know, guilty and like, should I have done something or whatever. We were once accused by a grandparent of killing their grandson because they, in their perception of the situation, we hadn't acted quickly enough. So we can also be at the sort of front end of some of that sort of feeling of guilt and responsibility from the family. And that was quite difficult, kind of compounded an already quite upsetting situation. But the death of a client can also have impact on that client's friends. It's a real reminder of people's mortality, and it can fuel a kind of sense of hopelessness. So you've got sort of all those feelings going on, and then alongside that you've got practicalities that can be a real mess. So there can be a lot of confusion about local authority funeral arrangements. When I was asking one of my head of service about this, she said there was a situation where quite a well-known rough sleeper died, didn't have any family. The local authority arranged a funeral for them and told the various agencies who actually knew this guy the wrong date of the funeral. And they all turned up for it, and there wasn't a funeral, and it was just a mistake by the local authority. But that was really upsetting for the staff who were there to express their grief and celebrate somebody's life. We had a client who died, a resident who died in the summer in our accommodation service, and she had no obvious next of kin. And it was really obvious that something very bad had happened, and in the project, and we couldn't tell all of the other staff and the rest of the residents who lived very closely with this woman and knew her well, because the police couldn't get hold of her next of kin for several days. And in the end, we just had to tell everybody because it was so difficult to contain that information. And it turned out that one of the other residents had sold this resident a load of coke, and they had been given a £20,000 back payment from social from their benefits, and they were starting to spend it in some quite unfortunate ways. And that situation created, you know, you could see that this resident who'd sold her the coke the night before she died was incredibly heightened and very anxious. The rest of the staff and the residents were really angry with her. We had to move her out of that setting really quickly and into another supported accommodation setting because we were quite concerned about both her but also everybody else being around her. We use reflective practice a lot as an opportunity to kind of explore those issues and how people are feeling. And it's really important as a team to acknowledge that it is really sad. So it's like, it's okay to be sad and let that out. So that's kind of reflecting some of what Duncan has said. Naomi asked me to say something about what needs to change. Well, in our experience, when someone's died, it's normally because there is long-term systemic failure throughout that person's life. So cases like Sarah Sharif that was in the news, was in the news around the sort of verdict a couple of weeks ago, the 9-year-old who died in near the New Forest, that really highlights what the issues are. And what systemic failure means. So I don't really need to labour that. I'm sure everyone is very familiar with it. And into adulthood, the deaths of clients can be attributed to really poor access to treatment and mental health services as well as housing. And I can't think of a time when someone's died from the cold. Interestingly, we've got SWEP going on at the moment. We're really good at responding when it's really cold. But there are plenty of other times when people are dying for other reasons. Westminster Council does a quarterly review of deaths, which is great, but there is a tendency to use it as a sort of arse covering exercise and getting very defensive about things. And I think it would be brilliant for everyone just to put the weapons down and be much more honest about why these things are happening. They're normally complicated. It's normally no one person's fault, but it's really important to be honest. And ultimately, I think the thing that needs to change is that people need to be not sleeping rough, and then they wouldn't be dying with an average age of 44. That would be great, wouldn't it? Finally, what have we learned? Well, having really good systems and policies to respond, so there is a bit of consistency. is really important. We do this work because we really care about people, and with that care comes this sadness when people die. And I'd be much more concerned if we weren't sad when people die. And it's difficult to create a policy which sets out what kind of relationship you want to, the kind of relational stuff and kind of how you care for people when they're really sad and bereaved and upset. So there's an extent to which you just have to put aside the hierarchy, put aside the kind of roles, and just be very human with your colleagues and with clients when someone dies.
Thank you, Pam. Excellent as always. I kind of two key themes. The last one, be very human, but the second one is actually prepare. It's going to happen. As organizations, we have policies often on everything else, from how to handle the petty cash through to, big safeguarding stuff. Actually having a policy that helps people know how to navigate the inevitable, sad inevitability of death, really help individuals in an organization. So I think that's a kind of really key takeaway. But thank you. And of course, that we shouldn't have people sleeping rough in the first place. Okay, brilliant. If you've got any comments on anything Pam said, we've put it in the chat, and I see that some questions are coming in, which is really helpful. So Mark from Housing Justice, we're going to come to you next. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Duncan. And I'm glad you shared some personal stuff. And I think it might be relevant, pertinent, helpful to share a little bit about the personal stuff where I'm coming at it from as well, and what led to that report that will be shared with everybody. So my parents were struggling at home. My mother, classic Irish Catholic mother with 6 kids in various places around the country and another one in the States. But so, she was obviously struggling with, she had terminal cancer herself, and Dad had Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, which go hand in hand, I learned. I didn't realize they go hand in hand. And she was doing the classic thing of, you carry on with your lives and, you support your kids and all the rest of it. And I'm fine. But I realized she was absolutely struggling in the family home. And so I had to get to grips with doing everything that was necessary to get the support they needed and try to be as independent as possible. And that was a full-time job for a good 6-8 months, before I eventually took a job with The Big Issue, which got me into the whole homelessness thing and listening to the vendors coming in and their stories and what they were contending with. And my parents are pretty competent people. And, just the thought struck me. It's like, here's these competent people who are struggling. And it's like, if you're homeless, what's it so much more of a challenge? So I took a job with The Big Issue and found myself as the coordinator of a shelter project in North London. And the governing charity for it was Caris Islington, which is a charity that actually started with a bereavement service, a really excellent bereavement service, actually, that were really good with their reach and who they supported. And then subsequently started a church shelter project, which I was the coordinator of for 10 years. And obviously, we were seeing folks coming into the shelter. It's still cited, I think, as in the top 10 from people experiencing homelessness, when we find them in the shelter, as, bereavement is in the top 10, as what brought about their homelessness, basically. And then there were folks coming into the bereavement service that obviously were in really precarious housing situations as a result. There was quite a lot of folks, quite a common one was where you had people caring for people, parents, siblings, in a council properties, and they die, and this carer wasn't on the tenancy, and so they find themselves home. That was quite more common than I realised, and so we decided. Thankfully, we had the Voluntary Action Islington together with an organisation called ARVARC, offered this opportunity to do some research, and because we thought, where's all this stuff? And obviously, when you do a research like this, a community research, the first thing you do is find out, okay, what's existing stuff is already out there. And when we did that, we found nothing. I mean, there's an ocean of stuff about bereavement. There's an absolute ocean of stuff about homelessness, but there was absolutely nothing directly connecting the two and talking about it. Nothing. I'd love to know if that's the case still, if people are aware of any other report other than the one we ended up writing. And everything I have to say about, bereavement and homelessness really is captured quite well. I was just reading it back, this was in 2010 and it's still relevant, I think. And I would really, encourage you to read it. So, and I suppose what I've taken away from it, I'm going to use, because Pam talked some great stuff about the practicalities and everything sort of behind the scenes that need to happen. And we had our annual conference on Tuesday, and Matt Potts spoke at it, and he talks about this concept of front of house and back of house. And when someone experiences, when they're suffering from bereavement, and bereavement, by the way, doesn't have to be, a person, certainly when it comes to homelessness, dogs in particular, but pets, and dogs in particular are real companions, like really important companions for people experiencing homes and on the streets. And, it can be as profound an experience and drastic an experience as it can be for a human being when their pet dies, their dog dies. So, yeah, Math Potts talking about this front of house, back of house. So what comes through for me through my whole experience of this is how important it is. Oh, and by the way, my partner she's an oncology nurse specialist, a clinical nurse specialist in oncology at Harley Street Hospital, private hospital. And most of her work is about discharging from hospital and about talking to people, families and patients, of course, about where they want to die. And obviously we talk a lot, and there's so much, the similarities, that contrast between people who have got the means, the resources, a support network and all the rest of it, still suffer the same issues but it's obviously exacerbated when you're homeless and your support network is pretty crap, to be blunt. If you haven't got a support network, that is awful, all the more awful and all the more challenging. But even for folks that have got all these resources and support, people can still get hit with a bereavement, a really profound sense of loss that they struggle despite all the resources available to them. That's what, in a lot of cases, a lot of sort of self-isolation occurs, So, and I think that's a really important point to make. But they're talking about this front of house, back of house. The most important thing, it seems to me, is about you've got to hold somebody when they've obviously been really hit and they're struggling. It's kind of like I've got a work colleague at the moment who recently shared with me that he's been given a cancer, stage 4 cancer. And this is a very professional, smart guy doing amazing work in the sector, actually. And he's struggling. It's like it's hit him so hard that he can't focus. He can't on his work and everything. Do you know what I mean? He's like, he's lost. And so the most important thing, whoever it is, but in particular, the most vulnerable people experiencing homelessness, is about holding them in the first place. And obviously sympathy, but empathy if possible, listening, compassion, love. These are the critical sort of front of house things that you need. And then, of course, there's all kinds of stuff that needs to go on, the machinations and everything that Pam's got into some detail on, about risk assessment, about safeguarding, about confidentiality, about information sharing, about access to services. There's this whole machine of stuff that needs to happen to make it, to use the term, if I may, a good death, because if it is handled really brilliantly, that helps so much with someone coping with the bereavement. It helps so much. They feel like everything possible was done and everybody was working together to support and help. And that is the crucial thing that needs to happen. So making that front of house, back of house thing work is really essential to this. is really essential. So I'm glad Pam spoke in some detail about it. I mean, I could go into a lot more about it. Please read the report. I mean, I remember one of the interviewees that we had when we brought them into the office to do the interviews actually went into crisis during the interview. And then we had this whole challenge of, okay, support for this person. And that whole process of accessing services, and this was somebody whose son had died from a violent death. She was living in a property that she just, as I'm saying, she just didn't pay the bills and everything. And so she ended up getting kicked out of her property. And then a family member took her in. So she was sofa surfing in the top floor of a block of flats that she wanted to throw herself out of. And here she was now sharing about it and talking about it in this interview, and she was in complete crisis. So then it's about contacting the services. And then there was this huge fight going on between north and south of the borough, the services, about who's responsible for her. And, you know, it's like computer says no kind of thing going on. So that was a real eye-opener, and speaks to this whole thing about front of house, back of house. And I think I'm just going to leave it there for now, actually, you know, just to, I hope I've sort of made the sort of really pertinent points that I wanted to make. And
Thanks.
yeah.
Thanks, Mark. That's really helpful. And then will be, of course, time for you to come back if you have any thoughts. I think for me, your point about just recognizing that bereavement hits hard anybody, even those with resources, material, family, and other. So how much worse is it for someone without those resources who's experiencing homelessness, or for a hard-pressed frontline worker who's still got somebody else they need to see and someone else they need to support? And we capture a lot in our frontline worker survey about the pressures facing frontline workers, but we're asking them to carry on often, and they're the ones who are closest to the person or the process of death. So how do we hold people? How do we have empathy, listening, and compassion, and both help front of house and back of house? I think that was really thoughtful. Thank you very much. So thanks, Mark. Now I'm going to turn to Gill from the Museum of Homelessness. Thank you, Gill, and for all the work you do at the Museum of Homelessness to kind of track or shine a light to people who've loved and lived as well as died. So thank you.
Thank you. Probably a lot of what I might share reflects what Pam and Mark have said. And I won't sort of go too much into my own personal experiences, except to say that I think for all of us, the line between the professional and the personal is always blurred. We're here because of our values and our experiences, and we channel that into our work, and that makes our work infinitely more emotional than for people who go to work for completely separate reasons. And probably the reason we're all in this room today is because we've all lost people that we've worked with or that we've loved in our personal lives from the issues that we're talking about today. And I think it's really important that we feel able to bring all of that into what we do. When we try to divorce who we are from what we do in our jobs, it only makes what we do harder. In fact, the best experiences that I've had in my professional life have been the ones that haven't asked me to leave my lived experience of homelessness or bereavement at the door, and instead have said it's okay to talk about those things here, albeit that it took me a long time in my career to be able to feel that I could do that. I'm here speaking as the strategic lead for the Dying Homeless Project, which is a research and a memorialisation project that is hosted by the Museum of Homelessness. But I'm also speaking from my experiences as a safeguarding adult reviewer, which is something that happens when people die, and the Safeguarding Adult Board determines that there's learning for agencies, which means that I sometimes get the intimate experience of looking at and talking to the life or about the life of someone who's passed away and thinking about all the things that might have happened differently, which is a complicated thing to do because hindsight is a wonderful thing. So I'm trying to share things that come from all of that. In 2024, we know that 1,611 people at least died whilst homeless in the UK. And that was a 9% increase on the year before and almost doubled from the beginning of the project. More people die every year whilst homeless. And despite all the efforts that we make to support people, that continues, and that average age at death continues. But I think something that helps me in the work that I do, which is so often about death, is remembering that for every death that is prevented or that is enabled to happen in a way which has dignity and care, that is work worth doing. And I think it's important to say that, because as practitioners, as when I was a frontline practitioner and till now, we have real relationships with the people that we work with. As Pam said, they are people that we grieve when they die. They're not people that we just wake up the next day and forget about. They matter to us, they impact us. We remember them for years and years into the future. And hopefully they help us to do better and to learn more things about how we can work in the future. One of the things that often happens is that we're told as professionals, whether implicitly or explicitly, that our grief is unprofessional somehow. It was really nice to hear what Pam was saying about supporting that grief at St. Martin's, because we need to do that if we're going to come to work the next day. We have to be people as well as professionals all the time. Otherwise, we find ourselves burnt out and going to work in other sectors where we don't have to face the pain and the difficulty of the work that we do. So I challenge anybody who says that grief and expressing that grief is unprofessional. In fact, I think it's one of the most professional things we do. It's the way of showing respect to people who might otherwise be made invisible. But as professionals, we also have a responsibility to learn from those deaths, to think about what it means for the work we do every day and for the systems that we're a part of. We have the unique opportunity to make change happen when we shout about things that went wrong, that could have been better. And as Pam said, about being accountable, not just accepting or pointing the finger of blame. We all might have done things differently, and that doesn't mean that we did something intentionally. And sometimes I think we get that a bit blurry. So learning, whether that is from things like safeguarding adult reviews or other kinds of learning events, reflective practice, etc., that happens around someone's death, they help us do our jobs better. But they also help us raise the really important structural systemic issues that are at the heart of people's deaths, like the barriers to services, like that lack of bereavement support, and ultimately the lack of a safe home that we all need to heal, to recover, to grow, to change. So taking that time feels crucial, and it's how we prevent future deaths as well as helping people have a good life. At the museum, the way that we work around death is through the Dying Homeless Project. We host a digital memorial that remembers everyone who died whilst homeless. Everybody here is welcome to make a submission to the memorial at any time about someone that you know who's passed away, with whatever information you would like to share about them. People often get in touch with us and say, I just need to say something about this person that wasn't written in a risk assessment or a needs assessment. I want to say what they liked and that they were funny and that they really had cool clothes or something like that. And we all too often only write about what's wrong and the deficits or the risks they lived with, and not that we just really like them as people and that other people did too. So we hope that the memorial is an opportunity for people to do that. We also host breathing room spaces where practitioners come together to talk about people they've lost, but also some of the ways they're coping with death in their organizations. Sometimes people come and say, we're not doing anything. Can I get some advice from someone else in the room about what they do in their organization? Sometimes people just want a space to say, I don't know how to process the grief of this death, this person that mattered to me. In my work as a safeguarding adult reviewer, one of the things I think I've also learned is that learning reviews and safeguarding adult reviews are also one of the ways that we show care. We say your death mattered enough that we're going to give it the time and attention to learn from it. So as much as that person won't benefit from that review directly, it is a way of making people visible and of saying we want to prevent some of these mistakes or to learn from this person's death so that in the future, other people will benefit from that learning, including ourselves. I was asked also to think about what needs to change, and we could talk about this for probably the entire day. But something that I think is really important is that we make remembrance a memorial standard. It shouldn't be the exception in only a few organizations and places in the country that we remember people. It should be everyone is remembered in everywhere that they might be. And it's been beautiful to have the opportunity to travel around the country and visit some memorials, attend some vigils, speak to people that are planting memorial gardens for people, and hear about how healing that is, not just for professionals, but also for people that are living in the same services, who lost their neighbours, who lost their friends. As Mark said, that bereavement is a powerful force that causes homelessness, but also keeps people homeless. Continued loss is something that most people that live on the streets and in hostels will experience over and over again. So how do we make sure that those deaths and that bereavement are still just as important as the first one, and that it doesn't become this idea that it's inevitable, that you're going to have people die next to you, next door to you, in the hostel that you live in the room that you might be in today? And the same is true for learning. It should be standard that every death is looked at, and we think and ask ourselves, what could we have done differently? And also, what did we do well? What were the points in that person's life where maybe they were accessing support, maybe they were doing the things they loved, and how can we learn about how to do more of that, not just less of the things that don't work? And maybe as part of that, how do we also really harness joy and hope? Sometimes our work is really depressing and we think we can't do the things we want, and we're up against so many different walls and barriers all the time. So how do we kind of try to harness joy in the work we do with the people we work with? Now that we've got so much less money in the system than we had when I started working in homelessness 20 years ago, we can't even sometimes take people for a cup of tea when we might want to. But actually, it's that cup of tea that honestly probably makes the difference for us as professionals between a good day and a bad day, when we get to have a joke with the people that we're supporting, not just filling in forms. And for them, they feel like we actually want to spend time with them. We don't just see them as something we need to process in the administration of every day. So how do we find opportunities to do more of that, more of the fun stuff? And that isn't me being naive or pretending that harm doesn't happen. It's hopefully me saying that in order for us to carry on doing this work when it is difficult, we have to also have the wins and the things that feel good and make us feel like we're doing something meaningful, not just the things that feel like admin, paperwork, emails. I guess the final thing that I want to say is that grief is normal, as it is a part of life for all of us, but that sometimes we, I think, get pulled into this inevitability that the people that we work with are going to die, and they're going to die young, and they're going to die horribly. But what we see when people are afforded good deaths is actually, as Mark and Pam both said, how meaningful that is, not just to them, but to their family who might have had an opportunity to reconnect with them, to their professionals that support them, that get to know that they died in a way where they were cared for, where they had the things they needed. In some cases, maybe for the first time in a long time, which is in itself an injustice somehow. So how do we make sure that people can have a good death, and that even when they do, that we get the space to grieve and to learn, and through that to activate some of the changes that we know are desperately needed? I think that's probably enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gill. You began by saying you didn't know you might add, and you've just added so many profound thoughts there. So thank you. That was really powerful. Just a couple of things come out. You talked about people as people and professionals, and we need to grieve. Actually, it's our sort of obligation as people and professionals to grieve. And I think that came through strongly about learning from the deaths, learning from deaths, how we can do our jobs better. Also, the systemic issues. But I think that point about what we do well also is really key. Sometimes everything right, a death has still happened, and we need to, and that is, we need to learn from that. Also, who people were, not just how they died, who they were, what we got from them as individuals. Your point about joy and hope, how we deal with continued loss, the importance of memorial, and the importance of a good death. That was incredibly profound. So thank you so much. So Amy, really appreciate your thoughts to add to everyone else's thoughts too. So thank you, Amy.
Thank you. And thank you, Gill. It was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much. And yeah, I kind of hope I can kind of add a few thoughts. It's interesting going at the end of one of these discussions. It's both disconcerting that people have said what you were going to say, but also reassuring that we're all thinking in the same way. This was a really difficult discussion to prepare for, and I think the fact that we're all here with no PowerPoint slides tells you that this isn't a topic that you can create a nice, neat presentation out of. I don't have any right or wrong ways to look at this topic. It's so charged with emotion, and what's really obvious to me is I guess death is the one lived experience that we all bring to work, and we should be permitted to bring that and bring our whole selves to work in terms of this topic. The statistics we've heard today I'm assuming won't be unfamiliar to most of you on the call. I think we've talked around the sort of average age of death amongst the homeless population being around the 40-something, but that has been like that for years. And I think what's striking about that is while the average age of death for everyone else in the population rises and rises, that number just doesn't seem to budge at all. All of the usual things are stacking up against people in terms of lifestyle and exposure, substance use we've heard a bit about, poor access to healthcare, low uptake of preventative care, all of the things that we take for granted that keep us well and healthy, that people are missing out on for various reasons. And obviously the quality of housing and the fact that people are in no housing at all. As I say, the odds sometimes feel really stacked. So it was great to hear something far more hopeful from Gill this morning. The other thing that strikes me is homeless services. We're not healthcare provision in any typical sense, and we're certainly not emergency services in any typical sense either. Yet the exposure to sort of poor health and premature death is much more prolific than in any other social care setting. I think about death a lot. I think we all do, to be honest. It's not just an age thing. I think we all do. And I think often about how someone has died and how that impacts on the people that they've left behind. And I find myself quite often mulling over it's not looking for a better way of people dying around you, but is it, thinking of how difficult it is to watch somebody who is perhaps terminally ill and to watch their death, be able to say goodbye and reconcile some of that, but at the same time watch somebody pass away and be powerless to do anything about it, how terribly hard that is. And at the same time looking at sudden death through accident and overdose and the shock that comes with that as well. They're both horrific in different ways. And the reason I say that is because I actually think the work that we do in the services that we all work in, we're kind of straddling both of those things at the same time. What I mean by that is that we're walking alongside people whose lives are lived very, very precariously. They're finding themselves in situations of huge risk over and over again. They're suffering health conditions which other people in other circumstances they wouldn't. And almost it's like life is nipping at the heels of those people sometimes, one adverse experience after another. And we're very, very conscious that death might happen. Yet when it does, it is often still sudden and shocking. And we're all still very sad and sometimes very angry. We're often forced into lots of different responses. And when I spoke to some of my colleagues and when I hear about the work that they're doing, there was a few things that kind of came through from those discussions. Many people have talked about often being the last person that spoke to that person or saw them before they died. That comes with a whole host of feelings about noticing things and whether they could have done anything different. There's a whole lot of guilt within my colleagues. Sometimes they might be the last person that's with them when they die. It's not unusual for me to hear of colleagues sitting all night long in hospital beds because quite frankly, nobody else is coming at 5 o'clock. I've heard of colleagues who have gone to visit people and come across their body, the person having passed away and no one yet knowing that in itself is very, very disturbing for people. A lot of colleagues talked of being informed about somebody's death because they are named as next of kin, quite often unbeknown to them. Their name has been added to a form somewhere. And some people feel like they want to be there when people's lives come to an end and some people don't. Some people we're able to break the news to quite gently in the way that we would experience it in our personal lives. And for other people, they're called quite bluntly by a housing officer or by a colleague in another organisation or sometimes by the police or health services. I heard a lot about the challenges of the practical stuff that Pam referenced earlier, having to make funeral arrangements for somebody who we know quite well, but we don't know in other senses because no one else is coming. that can be very challenging on an emotional level, but also on a practical level. The lack of other family and friends to make decisions or to decide what's to be said or to be present at a funeral, and sometimes the flip side of that being the presence of family and friends where there's a very difficult dynamic, which adds its own challenge to that process. But it's a burden which is felt very heavily amongst some of my colleagues. I thought about, as an employer, what we need to do, what could we do differently or better, and I guess I don't have much to add to what other people have said about, other than sort of ensuring that people have time to grieve. And quite often we don't build in time in our work to do anything other than assume that things are going to go smoothly or things are going to pan out the same as the week before. But we need to create time for people to grieve, and that needs to be on their own terms, whether that's at work or whether that's at home or on their own. We, at the same as St Martin's, offer a number of things on a real practical level, such as employee counselling, time to debrief, time with a clinical psychologist. All of those things are there. But I guess we need to make space for some of those. People deal with death and grief differently, and we need to create the time and space for people to do that on an individual basis. And I guess sort of what we talked there about being human, for me, this is there needs to be this porous boundary to help colleagues deal with death in the workplace. We are far less able to sort of deal with it as we would a sort of traditional, you're not well, you need some time off, or you've had a difficult day, can we help with the workload? It's a far different and more human response that's needed to support people through that. I'm very conscious of time and not wanting to repeat things that people have said, but I guess my final point was also about remembrance. I think a lot about the way people feature in statistics, and I get very, very frustrated when I see statistics about the number of people who are homeless, and I think about all the people who aren't in the statistics, and I always think, imagine not counting enough to be counted in the first place. And I feel sort of a similar way about remembrance, and I think this time of year it'll be, in a few weeks it'll be 10 years since my father-in-law passed away, and I'm thinking already we'll all be together, everybody will be remembering, there'll be, everybody will be there to support people through what will be a particularly challenging day. And for a lot of people that we work with, there is nobody to do that remembering other than us, and there's actually very few outlets for us to do that, to mark that on an ongoing basis. But obviously some of the things that we've heard from Gill and Pam today offer a lot of hope that there are ways that we can do that, and do that not just in a sense of remembering how sad and tragic it is that they've passed away, but actually how wonderful it was that people lived. And I'm going to stop talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. What a great sentence to finish on. That we remember people who lived, not just that they passed away. A couple other things that you shared. I think phrase guilt is very, I say it's a key part of grief for anyone, but particularly as well in the sector where you were that person who was more significant than often professionals are in other contexts. And I think recognizing that, I think the point about time to grieve and doing so differently, but your last point about time, one of the things that happens is people think grief is a process and think, well, we gave them 2 weeks compassionate leave, if that's, and many people don't even get that. They might not even get it at all. Grief is something that hits you. You talked about your father-in-law after 10 years. I talked about my mother after 30 plus years. That grief doesn't leave you, and that grief and loss is something that's there forever. And I think we need to kind of remember that it comes back. It comes back in odd ways, positive, negative. Hope this doesn't sound like a facetious comment, but maybe you're north of the border, and those of us who watched Scotland the other night, and Andy Robertson talk about Diego Jota after the match. That was really profound, and talking about how people are with you when you achieve great things and when you have sad times. And I think that's something that we need to kind of recognize more, your importance of remembrance and the importance of being human and the porous boundaries between personal and professional. So thank you, and thank you to all four of our speakers, Gill, Amy, Pam, and Mark. We've now got some time for questions and reflections. We've got one question at the moment, which I'll come to, but please, anybody who's got a question, it doesn't have to be, I realise we covered lots of quite profound issues. It could be, it doesn't have to be, don't sit there thinking, well, question, but it's very small and practical. Small and practical is as important as big and profound. So do ask your questions. We've got a question here, which is quite an interesting one, which is about someone's asking, surprised recently about a figure showing how many people are dying in supported accommodation, because we rightly talk about deaths on the street, but actually supported accommodation, which for many organizations is our accommodation or accommodation we're managing. And that so all sorts of questions about what might be going on there. Does anyone from the panel want to respond specifically to those issues about, I know you each touched on this to a bit, anything particular they want to pick up? Bill, was that?
I can
you'd like to come in
say
on
a
that?
little
Yeah.
bit from the Dying Homeless Project findings, if it's helpful. Yes, it's right. The majority of people that die whilst homeless do die in some form of accommodation. About between 9 and 12% of people die on the streets, but everybody else dies somewhere. I think in a way that obscures the impact of rough sleeping on those people's lives and deaths. Because actually typically what happens, and I'm speaking now from my experience as a frontline and practitioner and manager rather than the Dying Homeless Project, when someone becomes very ill, suddenly the system engages around them and they are found somewhere to stay, whether that be hospital or supported housing. So it means they die whilst in supported accommodation, but actually the thing that brought them perhaps to their death is those years of harm on the streets or in and out of hostels, hospitals and prisons, etc., that leads them there in the first place. So in a way, I think whilst it's true and perhaps good that most people are dying in some form of accommodation, it kind of obscures something else, which is that it's often all of the things, the years, the experiences that went before that really are at the heart of it. There's a lot of information in the Dying Homeless Project report about where people die, if anybody wants to have a look at it.
Thanks, Jill. And we're going to share links to all the reports. We've got some in the chat, but we'll share them all afterwards. And Pam's policy too. Anybody else got a reflection on supported accommodation specifically?
I could just to add something. So Housing Justice considers itself to be a voice for the 110 plus projects up and down the country, sort of grassroots faith and community response, emergency accommodation, and now increasingly what is effectively supported accommodation, and there's a real scope to that. And something that we ask everybody to input data at the end of the winter season into our impact portal. And one of the trends that has come out from this last winter is the number of people that are knocking on their day services doors, whether it be drop-ins, day centres, etc. The number of people that are dropping their doors that are hidden homelessness, people in these accommodation settings that Jill's talking about and you can read about in the Dying Homeless report. The increasing number of these people that are coming looking for help because they're not getting, in some cases, they're just not getting the support that they should be getting. And that's not, I don't want to point the finger too much because the services are the caseloads that people are dealing with and, the demand is so huge. Obviously there's the conspicuous rough sleeping. It's the hidden homeless problem. I refer to it as the monster that is hidden homelessness, that I don't think people are aware about the scale and the scope of it. We see all these figures put out by Shelter about 300 households homeless, but we need if we came up with a definition, well, that's part of the problem. We still have not come up with a definition of hidden homelessness that the sector can agree on. But if you consider everybody precariously housed, so there's 2 million people alone on council waiting lists. Yeah, there's close to 1 million people in overcrowded household situations. Sofa surfers, huge, beds in sheds, people riding public transport all night, people fleeing domestic violence. There's a whole raft of things that you can include in that. And if you were to include all those things, then that figure is at least 4 million people. 4 million people in a first world country that are precariously housed. And that is the monster that is prompting the rough sleeping problem, because they spill out of these precarious housing situations into rough sleeping when they can't sustain it anymore. So it's a huge crisis and a desperate problem. And no wonder that, the person who asked the question, asked the question.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. And I think a couple of thoughts. So one is always the recognition that there are many people who are in homeless situations that don't come into contact with homelessness services. They maybe come into contact with other services, and might be GPs, or might be libraries, cafes, faith communities, who are also in this subject having to pick up some of the things we talk about without even, however stretched out boundaries, and other people picking the issues up of loss and grief without even that professional support. So we need to be thinking about that. I also think the question about supported accommodation specifically prompts what the homeless sector did a lot of work that was thinking about. It's not just having a bed for the night, it's having a reason to get out of bed in the morning, something positive to do, which helps move you on from harmful behaviors and addictions, and gives you purpose and meaning, and gives you those opportunities for joy, which Gill, you talked about. Sadly, as the sector becomes more stretched, we're going back to that. Often it is that we're just doing rung one on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We've got people into accommodation, we're moving on, and we do need to think about how we can provide those opportunities for people to live, not just to sleep out and exist. So that is a real challenge. So we've had some really good questions come in, which are I'm going to group them together and ask for your reflections. So one of them is, if any of the panel could share how they've shared the news of a passing with their teams and other service users. The person asking the question feels increasingly having to do this to break the news of loss and death, and wondered if there's any ways they could improve this delivery. And then a sort of linked question is one that's about someone saying, what if as an individual is unable to grieve their loss or losses? If they're struggling to grieve, how do we kind of help create that space for them to do so? So as with everything, both those questions are very much crossing the porous boundary between personal and professional. But anybody feel that they can those? Amy.
I was going to say, I mean, firstly, to the person who asked the question, I'm sure you're doing it well already, and I think again I have recently been in a very unfortunate situation where I had to break the news of the sudden death of a colleague to many people within our organisation, people who worked very closely with her, people who worked within the services that she worked in. And I guess the only thing I can say is the really obvious stuff about taking the time to think about who needs to know, because it's not necessarily how you break the news that would be the most difficult, that you could do wrong. I think the worst thing is somebody hearing later or from the wrong person. And I think sort of it's almost, to be brutally honest, something you need to sit down and plan through. Who needs to know, and when and how, and where will they be, and how can I reach them? If you put a mass email out to your whole team saying you all need to come into the office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m, they spend the evening with that, when what's going on at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. So it can be very challenging, particularly if you're working with people who are scattered in different locations or working on outreach. But I guess the only thing I can say is I'm sure you're doing it the right way if you're doing it yourself, that you're doing it in person where possible, and just to give enough time for that. Because what I certainly have experienced is that a lot of the time is sitting with the silence with people. And that can be, so creating the time and space. Sorry, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm sure you're doing it really well. In terms of the question about how people manage their grief in all sorts of different ways. And I think if I take that example again, we had a number of people who just needed to go and have time with themselves. We had a lot of people who wanted to come to work. Sometimes work and being busy and having a purpose is how people get through it. And I guess if you think about your own situations, where if you've had friends or family who've passed away, one of the ways you get through that is by being busy organising things. It's the same for your colleagues at work. If they can find an outlet that makes them feel practical and useful, then that can be one of the ways that they start to get through things.
If I could just add something, if I let everybody know that, so at the commemoration service last Thursday, I had 3 people approach me to say they learned of people they know that had passed away at the service, and how grateful they were that they learned that way at that service. The service was, it is such an amazing thing. It's such a tragic thing, and yet it's amazing how I know a lot of people, if not most, but certainly me, every year, you know, you can't help but get so emotional and well up, and it's so tragic. But you go away feeling uplifted somehow. That shared acknowledgement and celebrating people's lives. It's like we ask people when they, the 4 tranches of names, and when they read, I mean, you call it a eulogy, but we ask people not for it to be a sort of typical sort of gushing eulogy. You know, be real about the people and talk about how you've benefited from knowing that person. You know, it's one of the most brilliant community, you know, we've got these community connectors now, and I'm starting to refer to it as a community connection event. You know, it's because it, you know, being acknowledging everybody's life, regardless, you know, it's such an important thing. And for us to, you know, with so much othering going on at the moment in the world, you know, we need more events like that. We need more acknowledgement that we are a human, as a human race, we are a family, you know. Let's treat everybody like family.
Thanks, Mark. Pam or Gill, any reflections?
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking there, Mark, I was kind of thinking, so as a senior manager, and I'm a bit removed from a lot of the kind of realities of what happens, whilst I'm enormously sympathetic, I often don't know the people that have died. And I think, I mean, for me, the service of commemoration gives me an opportunity to kind of show that I really care about the issue and about people. And the thing that sets me off is not so much the clients that have died, it's the number of my staff team that I never considered to be particularly interested in going to church services who go. And I mean, I'd at least a quarter of the connection staff team was at the service, and you know, we're still, you know, the day centre is still open when we're running it, and it's really striking how much people really care, and that makes me incredibly proud of my colleagues because they're kind of quietly getting on with it. When we had Martha die in the summer, I got phoned up at the weekend by the member of staff or the manager of the service to tell me what had happened because she needed to do the kind of reporting thing. And at that moment, I just thought the most important thing I could possibly do was be really sympathetic and nice and supportive about it. And it's like, don't worry, we'll sort out the, you know, the sort of admin and all that kind of stuff in the week. But both myself and the director of service just went to the project to see the staff team. They didn't particularly want to talk to us about it. They didn't particularly have anything specific to say, but they did really appreciate the fact that we had noticed and we knew about it and we cared about what had happened, and we wanted to make sure that people were all right. It was just like just having a bit of presence so that people knew that we had noticed. And I think, you know, I don't want to kind of unnecessarily welly into situations where I don't know people very well because it's just a bit intrusive. But I do think it's important that even if like me, you are a bit removed from some of the day-to-day activity, it's just important that the staff team know that I give us stuff about it, and I care about the clients, and I care about the impact that has on the staff team.
Thanks, Pam. Gill, you've come off mic. Do you want to say something?
Very just agree with everything everybody's said, and just from my own experiences, both as we've all had of hearing about deaths and also sharing them, it's also there isn't a right way. Sometimes the easiest thing to do is be furious with your manager about how they told you about how somebody died, because you're actually just really sad and you need somewhere to put it. And so it's easy when you're someone who has to do the telling to think that there's a way you could have told people that might have meant that it landed well, but but it won't ever land well. So that someone's put in the chat, and I think it's really great, that the best way of thinking about how your staff might want to learn something is asking them first. But even when you do that, there'll probably still be some people that are annoyed with you because you didn't do it quite right, or it wasn't quite the way they'd hoped. So maybe just as a reassurance that the fact that you're thinking about this, as Amy said, means you're probably already doing it the best you can, but also that part of that trauma response or that grief response we have is sometimes anger and sometimes frustration. And so if you hear that from people, it's not necessarily because you've done it wrong. It's just very hard information to hear.
Thank you, Gill. And I also think one of the things that's most important to think about grief generally is often that very British reaction has been, I'm getting it wrong, so they don't say anything. And that's the worst possible thing. And sometimes, I think, as you said, Pam, sometimes just showing up, say that actually as a colleague, a team leader, or a senior manager, I think your point, Amy, about silence, sometimes just being there is really just having being comfortable with the silence, not just saying, well, trying to move it on. Don't feel, don't move the silence on. And I think another reflection is also use the frameworks that already exist. So actually, with a colleague, one-to-ones, just making sure that there's a point at the end, you pause and just like, how are you? And you just leave it hanging. And they might say something or they might not, but actually, I remember I had a colleague, not a frontline worker, but a colleague had recently had a bereavement, and I just engineered having a chat about work. But then could use the space at the end to just them the space to talk. And they did. And so sometimes you can do things quite formally, create those spaces for shared acknowledgement, but sometimes, Jill, your point about a cup of tea, just making that space to do it, and then you can and if you keep regularly doing it, and someone might open up 1 out of 5 times, but they know you're there, and that provides a space for something to happen. So thank you. And that other thing about we are social beings, and that space for shared reflection. At a time when loss in the homelessness sector is often about people being on their own, and therefore just creating the shared spaces for clients and staff is really key. There's a couple of comments that people have talked about. There's one interesting one about this issue about kind of the role of faith, and someone talked about having local clergy, and Pam talked about one of the vicar at St. Martin's who can support people with faith or non-faith. And I think again in this kind of, we sometimes get a bit squeamish about saying, oh, we don't really want to make assumptions, don't want to do faith. We don't want to, of course we shouldn't impose faith, but sometimes it can be actually just having a person of standing. This is what happens in the prison system with prison chaplains and things like that as well. A person of standing in a faith, they don't also again as a sign, they're seen as a sort of someone official, and it gives a bit of recognition that there is a space there. They may say a prayer, they may not. Again, it can have a place. Even we shouldn't just assume that no one wants to touch faith because they haven't explicitly said they should want to do so. So there can be something there. We haven't got any other questions that I can see, but do
Duncan,
back if there's anything we missed. But yes, Pam, sorry.
Duncan, I've just got something to add to that. So I'm saying this, some of you already know this, most of the panel know this. So my dad is a minister, which means that I was there in the back office, like when I was growing up, when, the phone would ring and someone, and it would be someone phoning up my dad to tell him that a member of the congregation had died. And this used to happen sort of quite frequently, bearing in mind the demography of church congregations. It's a real core skill that people who work in religious institutions have. And if you're ordained or the equivalent of that in any other faith setting, it's something that people have really deep training and expertise in. And good religious people of whatever faith don't actually get too caught up in what the denomination or what the particular faith or no faith background is of the person who's died. Their focus is on what is appropriate for that person in marking their passing. When I first came to the connection, there was quite a lot of squeamishness about engaging with the church on this issue, and there had been a member of staff who had a lot of lived experience of rough sleeping, who had died under some quite suspicious circumstances the previous year, and the church had been sort of deliberately excluded from being involved in that situation. And I think that was a real shame, because you could, even when I arrived a year later, people were talking to me about it, and there had not been an institutional way of appropriately responding to that situation. And when Amy's just talking about her experience with the death of a colleague, I mean, Amy and I worked with somebody who died. I had already left the Cyrenians by that point, but Amy and I worked with that man very closely for a long time, and it's incredibly upsetting. So I think, yeah, sort of doing things to acknowledge and mark people's passing with somebody who's got that kind of experience, they can hold a lot of the feelings that are around for a community of people.
Just to say that I've put in the chat there this report, Lost and Found. Actually, we did a lot of the work at the Connection, actually, from some time ago, talking about faith in the homeless sector, basically. And the author is a lovely Welsh gentleman who's actually an atheist. So it's all done from a very sort of subjective, objective kind of approach, and looking at what people want and how they feel about the whole faith thing when it comes to homelessness. So yeah, just if people are interested, yeah, I think it's a good read.
Thank you both. Yeah, I mean, yeah, humanity devised rituals because they have a way to help, and we've got that sort of received wisdom from previous generations that they could help. I remember at Crisis, we had a client who died and he had no family member, and it was, as I said, one of those kind of local authority led funerals with a really cheap casket. Thankfully, we had the right date. One of our frontline workers had also been was a member of the Simon community, and we all went along, and they were able to kind of lead a semi-faith-based ritual, and it just was really helpful in and showing that we mattered and we cared. So unless there's anyone else who's got another question, I'm just going to go to each of the panelists. Oh, someone's just put in a comment actually about the role of Samaritans and listening. I think can't overestimate the importance of listening and listening. And interesting in this topic, what we've shared. So sometimes the reflective listening way, we're just not bringing any of ourselves to bear. We've talked actually a lot on this topic about how sometimes this is an area where bringing ourselves to bear is also useful, which is a difficult one because we normally tell people to just kind of keep the boundaries, but actually it is the one experience we share, the universal human experience of grief and loss. And it is the one where done well, not imposing what happened to you, but done well. If you show a bit of yourself, it does help the other person understand. So I think that is a really interesting kind of thing here, that we do cross the boundaries a bit. Yes, fantastic work that Samaritans and others do is hugely valued, but also showing up as a human is also hugely valued, and navigating that. But we're going to share everything that everybody has said, all the reports. I know there's some in the chat, but we'll share them all afterwards. We'll also just get some feedback from you. Let us know what worked and didn't work. We will also share this webinar for those who weren't able to join us, and do share with colleagues. The importance of self-care. Hopefully you don't all have to rush off straight. If you can take 2 minutes, make a cup of coffee, and look after yourselves in whatever way you do in your own organizations. To finish, if I may, I'm just going to come to each of the panelists and just any final thoughts that they've got from what you've heard today or reflected on. Any final thoughts that you'd encourage people to think about in terms of loss, grief, and bereavement in the homelessness sector? Amy, would you like to go
I
first?
I
Thank
was
you.
just going to just picking up on what you just said a moment ago about bringing yourself, and I think it's if you allow yourself to be vulnerable in front of other people, then it permits other people to have that response if that's what they need to as well. And I can't hammer home how important that is. So in terms of modeling, modeling, not modeling how to do grief, but modeling not being okay.
Thanks, Amy. Because in the end, it's the most profound thing. You've lost something that you can't make better. And just being vulnerable and authentic in that is the start of people being able to kind of themselves process and respond.
I'd just like to add to that and agree. Absolutely. I mean, because there's so much drilled into us, certainly in the homeless sector these days and other areas, but about boundaries and confidentiality and privacy and all the which are really important. Absolutely, they're really important. But when it comes to this, sitting and just being a human being with somebody and parking whoever you are out in the world and just be a human being with somebody and sharing is crucial. Is crucial. And I think you said it really well, Duncan and Gill, talking about that. It's mutual encounter. It's about a mutual encounter.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Mark. Pam, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I just wanted to say that I think when people die, they kind of stay with us in their own way. And the person that Amy and I worked with who died a couple of years after I left Cyrenians, I still reference him in all of our new staff inductions at the Connection. And that's making me feel really emotional actually just thinking about it. Yeah, people stay with us.
Thanks, Pam. Bill.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I guess maybe the invitation of joy is rather than having those people haunt us, let them be the thing that energizes us so that we do the things we know need to happen. Because we're all doing this because we think that change must come. And we keep doing it year on year, many of us for far too long now, because we believe that it's possible. And for each person who dies, someone else might live. And let that be the thing that pushes us forward rather than the grief or the frustration or the anger. Let it be joy and hope instead. Now we're all crying.
Thank you, Jill. And I think that two sides, a death follows a life, and we have to remember them both. The life they lived, and the death they've had, and we need to celebrate them both. Yes, learn, reflect, but hold that and use it to recognize it will take time and challenges to process, but also use it to push us forward in why we do what we do. Thank you so much to Jill, Amy, and Mark. Thank you to all of you who joined. Sometimes in webinars you get drop-offs. I know a couple of people had to go, but we pretty much have people stay consistently, which is a sign that thank you for engaging in everything. And hopefully something you've heard today will help you in your own workplace, your own lives, your own griefs and ways forward. So thank you, everybody. As said, we'll share all the material. Take care of yourselves. Look after each other. Thanks again to Jill, Amy, and Mark. See you all soon. Thank you. Take care.